We can go ahead and get started. A warm welcome and thank you for joining us for the very first Zetta Bytes Live. I'm your host, Jocelyn Goldfein, and so glad you're here. This is hosted by Zetta Venture Partners. We are a San Francisco-based VC firm. We write the first institutional check into AI-first startups with B2B business models. And we believe technology powered by data will reshape business as we know it. And Zetta Bytes Live is a new program organized around telling those stories. We'll feature deep dives into state-of-the-art in AI platforms and showcase industrial applications of AI with top industry leaders, like today's guest. Elliott Wolf is Vice President and Chief Data Scientist of Lineage Logistics, the largest temperature-controlled warehouse owner and operator in the world. Approximately 80 billion pounds of food annually transit Lineage's 293 facilities. And Fast Company named Lineage #1 in data science and number 23 overall in its 2019 rankings of most innovative companies. Elliott holds a BS in mathematics from Duke, an MS in statistics from Stanford, and a JD from Stanford also. Elliott, thank you so much for joining us today.
No, thanks for having me.
We've known each other for a couple of years. I'm going to ask you the question I couldn't quite hold back the first time we met. You've got an amazing background. You could have any job you want in data science or AI. Why on earth are you working for a food logistics company?
Well, I mean, it's kind of funny. Then the normal paths into kind of technology roles were just kind of defaults of like, oh, you go to one of the FANGs because that's just what you do. This was much more of a deductive journey. If you look at the nature of the business, it's got all of the logistics complexities of an Amazon, plus you have to keep everything cold, which is an exercise in thermophysics. It's a super science-heavy business, just inherently. When I started there in 2013, I'm in an odd situation of having had the same job for 7 years now, no one was really working on it. And even today, I've got a team of about 12 people, but really we're the only ones kind of in the space. And so it's been fun to make a difference.
So I guess you kind of alluded to this is a science problem, but what kinds of problems does a logistics company have that can be solved with math and with data? Like what kinds of expertise does your team need to have and what kinds of projects are you doing?
So let me share some stuff. Katie, can you make me the host again so that I can share the screen? The long and the short of it is that just imagine the food supply chain. So you have got a basically multi-millennial effort, the entire history of humanity, geared towards figuring out how to feed itself. And the modern incarnation of that is a whole bunch of pooled infrastructure, whereby almost no one that manufactures food is actually responsible for the handling and distribution all the way down to the consumer. What instead happens is people go through facilities like this. This is a rendering of a plant we operate in Charleston, South Carolina. We have these things everywhere. And if you add our competitors to this, it's basically close to food producing regions and it's close to population centers. So it is everywhere. And ultimately it's storage capacity. And basically you would not have heard of Lineage Logistics. You probably would not have heard of our competitors, but you would have heard of our customers, whereby this is 8 tons of Sabra hummus sitting on a dock in Richmond. We do all the blasting for Chick-fil-A. If you're gonna have a chicken sandwich, don't forget your 55-gallon drum of honey barbecue sauce. We handle most meat exports or most refrigerated meat exports out of US ports. We even receive deadliest catch. So this is a fishing trawler from the Bering Sea unloading at our facility at the Port of Seattle. And now to give a long-winded answer to your question, imagine the problems associated with this. The most important, arguably, part of cold storage is the cold. You accomplish that by moving and controlling the temperature of air. That is an exercise in physics. This is a CFD simulation that we made of a blast cell that a person on my team named Alex Zhang designed. You could call this AI, you could call this data science. It's actually applied physics, but whatever. It's a giant high dimensional gradient descent. And so if you know the mathematical methods to do AI ML, then you also know how to do stuff like this. You've got your kind of classical supply chain graph theory problems. So these are all networks whereby food generally comes from, let's just say there's many fewer locations where food is coming from than locations where it's going. And so high in the supply chain, close to the manufacturers, the farmers, the CPG companies, is going to be relatively few sites, and then it's going to fractal out. It's going to go to regional distribution for shipments across entire states. And then from what this is showing is from those regional distribution centers, it's now going to the local distribution centers of the retailers. And so there's a time domain in which this is happening. You have to have sufficient frequency of shipments because this stuff is perishable. There's huge utilization complications whereby you've got a 90,000 pound gross weight 18-wheeler tractor trailer. You're trying to utilize it. There's just all kinds of logistics complexities. We've even had, I mean, when you work in logistics, you have these just crazy conversations where this was us thinking about renting an entire freight train. And so we were trying to mine who was going in with meat from the Midwest into the Port of Long Beach, LA. So that we could see whether they're just the volume justified actually like getting our own dedicated freight train. There's a whole bunch of warehouse design questions. And so, for instance, the rack on the left is probably default in the supply chain. The rack on the right is what we build using reasonably advanced stats and combinatoric mathematics, where we're trying to predict the distribution of pallet sizes. These things vary seasonally, they vary by market, but you use a bunch of fancy stats to figure out a reference distribution that's safe, and then you use a bunch of fancy computer science to assign different height objects to various rack columns, and then you go have a general contractor go build it for you.
So what you're saying is you solve a literal bin packing problem.
Yes, we actually physically bin pack physical systems. And then I think the kind of magnum opus, at least of the combinatorics and the statistics, is now the robotic applications in warehousing. With COVID, supply chain resiliency is frankly trying to depend less on the humans. There's certain huge environmental and energy benefits from building robotic warehouses. They can be physically taller, so you need less concrete, you need less refrigeration. And at least up until COVID, the labor market was really, really tight. And so as we're trying to schlep more food through the same assets, more food to feed a growing population, we like literally could not find the labor that we needed. And then lastly, I think for your purposes, I'll touch on probably what I think is the most interesting area of kind of classical AI ML, which is vision. This is a device that we developed actually with a startup to identify labels on pallets. One of the main manual processes in the supply chain is saying, okay, this stuff is unloaded from a truck. What is it? How many cases are there? Are the day codes square? Is this expired? Is this damaged? And these are kind of classical vision applications. But then also we're using vision, mainly low compute, low profile, low power innovations from quadcopter drones in order to localize forklifts within facilities. And so you put little
you're flying drones through the warehouse and repositioning forklifts based on what you see?
No, so we took the compute package off of a drone that could fly around the warehouse and then just duct taped it to a forklift, and that tells us all kinds of interesting things. So
that's great.
I'll stop there.
I love that.
That's kind of a high level overview of our problem set.
Awesome. So when I talk to IT leaders at Fortune 500 companies, it seems that very often the problems with adopting AI are not technology problems per se. It's not lack of expertise or resources. It's really kind of, a lack of maybe a cultural leaning towards innovation or change. When you first started in your job, was data science valued? Did your management team understand what the value was?
I think so. The now semi-famous quote from the chairman of the company, and separately from my boss, the CIO of the company, was, hey, we hear there's math and logistics. Will you come take a look? I mean, that was like the level of the marching orders. And,
so you had a lot of blue ocean, white space.
Right. I mean, there's certain fundamental certain fundamental kind of observations here. The first is that when you're hired into a position like that, your overlords are hiring you precisely because you're supposed to know more about what's possible than them. And so you need from the very beginning kind of mutual trust. And the agreement was, if you don't want us here, if you don't want me here at the time alone, then I don't want to be here, because if you don't want me here, then it means we can't make a difference together. So fire me when as soon as you want to. But until then, we start out with maximum trust capital, because there's going to be a whole lot of stuff that's going to come out of the mathematical AI ML realm that you're just not going to understand, and you're not going to know the value of, and you're just going to have to trust that this is going to be good. Now, I reciprocated that trust by, in the very beginning, putting everything in kind of tautological business terms. And so one of the very first applications that we deployed was actually this designing of the warehouse racks for increased density. And so it's like, well, what can math do for you? It's like, well, build warehouse space. And that's a pretty fundamental economic driver in the industry, especially when you're paying $300 a square foot on refrigerated construction, and having to buy land, and then having to spend millions of dollars a year keeping it at 0 Fahrenheit. If you can just change the pegs on your IKEA bookshelf according to what your mathematician said and achieve the same thing, that's pretty fundamental. And that's probably a good illustration of how we operate. The objective is crystal clear and no one can disagree with it. The actual mechanics of it are opaque to someone who hasn't gone to graduate school in math or statistics.
So it sounds like you got some points on the board right away. Like you showed them,
yeah.
You showed them the money kind of right out the gate. How long did that first project, like that the maximum trust thing is a bold approach. I mean, I think there's probably a lot of people on the call who are either entrepreneurs who are trying to sell to enterprises, or who are working inside enterprises trying to innovate like you are. And I'm sure they're sort of taking this story to heart, but like, how long did you have before you showed them some value?
So we got some quick wins within about 4 to 5 months. But I had actually been very careful to negotiate at the beginning that this would take time. And the thing that took time was not so much getting the wins, it was learning the business. I mean, I had a background in private equity. Lineage is a very large levered buyout, so I knew those those kind of economic drivers, but I never worked in logistics before. And I wanted to be respectful of the knowledge that the operators had in the field. So I spent 3 or 4 months on the road traveling, meeting people, learning the business. And there are certain people in the company who can take credit for teaching me warehousing. It's hard, it's complicated.
Yeah, this reminds me of something I always look for in a founding team, which is that you need people who deeply understand the technology. You can't just like, farm it out to a low-cost location, because this stuff is cutting edge. But at the same time, you also need people who deeply understand the domain.
Absolutely.
I think it's sort of always been true in technology, but for data in particular, it's so easy to fool yourself and think it means something different than it does if you're not deeply grounded.
And even today, I mean, the posture that we take is, I think, correct to the circumstances. It's literally true, is that we know more about math and physics than our operators do. Our operators know more about warehousing than we do. And that makes for a great collaboration. Like your members on a team.
That makes perfect sense.
Hold hands, put more in the box.
That's right. Okay, so we're 15 minutes in. We got to talk about COVID-19. Forget about AI for a second. When that hit, what was that like? How did things shake out over the first 30, 60 days? I mean, we're all getting groceries just fine now, but I feel like at the beginning we were all, panic buying pasta and trying to figure out if we would run out of food.
So Katie, let me share again. Let me give some kind of context here. So first, COVID happens. There's kind of 2 failure modes associated with the supply chain. The first, I'm not even going to full screen this. The first is that you now have what effectively is a unavailability of labor. You're trying to immediately start to social distance. That effectively hamstrings your throughput capacity. You might have employees who are very concerned about how to stay safe in that environment. And so you effectively have to handicap your labor throughput. And then the second failure mode is that you now have a tidal wave of volume that needs to go out. And you've got people panic buying, people freaking out. People are basically making an assumption that this stuff is not going to be available and therefore buying loads of pasta or loads of whatever. The good news though was that those failure modes were not alien to us. So we've had labor shortages for years, especially go back 18, 19, like really hot economy. We actually rely pretty heavily on machine learning to figure out where to put stuff in the warehouse. And that affects a increase in labor productivity. And so we basically, the loss of the labor plus the good operational practices, some of which data science contributed to, others of which were just learned and refined by our operations team over years, really kind of allowed us to net them out. The other thing that we did was we intentionally simplified the orders. And so the objective of the supply chain under normal circumstances is to guarantee availability of your cornucopia of yogurts. You can stand in the grocery store and gawk at, I want boysenberry, gluten-free, whatever. We together decided, forgive my French, but ain't nobody got time for that shit. We started changing up in conjunction with our customers and said, okay, you used to ship 5 items out. Now you're shipping 2. You used to want half this pallet. Now you're getting the full pallet. And it worked out well because they now have the demand to use that up downstream. And so this was very, very, very much by design. But the critical thing is that when you have a crisis like COVID, the work that you do before it matters the work that you do during it. And so take other failure modes that consumers may not know about. So take shrimp. Shrimp is a very heavily imported commodity into the United States. Basically, the Gulf is the only provider of shrimp in the U.S. and they're primarily distributed regionally. Most of the shrimp that we consume will come from Asia. And if you look at the rankings of the various exporters to the United States, it's been wildly gyrating for the last several years. So Thailand went down, India went up, Ecuador, this kind of upstart, started at number 7, and now they're number 2. This was actually due to a animal pandemic. Thailand, the primary supplier of shrimp to the U.S. market, was hit by something called the yellowhead virus. It's a distant cousin of the coronavirus, and so suddenly their exports to the U.S. are down 80%. We've had huge global warming-induced squid shortages. I mean, global warming is definitely a thing. It's something that we monitor very closely, and it's just catastrophic effects on certain fisheries that we see in our data. And one of them was squid, calamari. And so in 2013, you had 118,000 tons come in. In 2019, we had 10% of that, less than 10% of that. And it was coming in during different times. And so these are things that happen when you are normally dependent on Mother Nature for all of your stuff and things that you're trying to hedge around. And so there's a working assumption in our industry that like you're just going to get kicked in the head. El Nino is going to take out a bunch of fruit, or some fishery is going to fail, or some pork virus, as recently in China, is going to take out 60% of the Chinese pork population. And so that's just normal. That's just normal for us relative to COVID. And so the net result of that is that we store a lot of inventories. And so there's just enormous quantities, like months of supply sitting upstream in certain freezer and refrigerated commodities. And that's really what we relied on. The difficulty was not whether the food was available, it was schlepping it and the relatively high demand. And in retrospect, It was actually about the size of Thanksgiving. And so these warehouses are what we refer to as our mega RDCs. They ship directly to retail distribution centers. You see this upswing in kind of mid-March to mid-April. That's COVID. But you see these huge upswings during Thanksgiving and Christmas, and that's normal. No one thinks twice about it. But the difference is you don't know when it's coming. So we didn't know exactly when it would happen. We didn't know exactly how big it would be. We didn't know exactly how long it would last. And so then it becomes an exercise in trying to put out fires.
What were some of the fires?
So some of the fires were that we had made the decision that we needed to decon certain facilities. And so how do you, like, we're not going to compromise worker safety. And so, but now you have to start bringing in product from other warehouses. Now you have to play musical chairs, as it were. Some of the failure modes were just that there was huge regional differences in panic buying. So this facility serves the northeastern US. And I mean, so this is a 75% increase in their volume.
Yeah.
And like, what do you do with that? Like in their particular case, we employed a whole bunch of strategies, simplifying orders. The ops team at that particular site is just absolutely tremendous. And they had worked close with the customer on everything from how to simplify the orders to how to get the trucks to be on time so that they didn't have anyone standing around unutilized. On the flip side, this facility serves Los Angeles. The entirety of Los Angeles basically seemed to go, Instacart, yo, like
I'm fine.
Right.
I'll be fine.
Right. And so then it becomes an issue of how do you play whack-a-mole, as it were. And that's an operational question. You absolutely positively need the highest level skilled operators. I mean, it is a skill to manage a plant and schedule your labor and motivate people to make stuff happen when it needs to happen. But it's also a data question. We have developed over years the systems in place to be able to see all this stuff in real time. We can see automatic operational alerts of whether something's about to go sideways. We have a whole bunch of techniques for that, but we also have a whole bunch of infrastructure for it. And so,
well, this is probably a good segue back to our topic of data science and AI. I mean, that was an incredible, I think most of us were alarmed about food and then were relieved that it didn't end up being a crisis. But I don't know how much of us realized that how much work was going on behind the scenes to keep it from being a crisis. But can you give us a sense of how data science and your team in particular were able to help with the firefighting, or were you kind of mostly just, hey, it was the guys in the warehouse being heroic?
Right. I mean, I got to give all the credit to the guys in the warehouse. I think they went above and beyond. And this was at a time when we didn't fully understand how to protect against COVID transmission. In retrospect, warehouses are very large. You've got about 2,000 square feet per employee. But at the very beginning of this, no one had any idea of, like, someone sneezed in a freezer and then someone walked in the same vicinity a day later. What does that do?
Right.
And so the real heroes of this were at the site. As far as data science is concerned, there were really a couple of things. There was first the systems that we helped build over years for monitoring the operational health of facilities. It's a pretty common IoT application. It's almost like the default IoT application is to predict machine failure. But large industrial plants, particularly ones that are manually operated, are very much like machines. You've got this thing feeding this thing, feeding this thing, this process feeding the next process, feeding the next process, and it becomes cyclical. And if you have a problem in one particular location, that's going to break something downstream. But there's a huge stochastic element to it, which is the person. And so it's more of a statistical exercise than anything else to figure out, okay, how big of a deviation is something that we have to worry about? Because this thing is not going to be as well behaved as a diesel engine, but there are certain things that we can see. And so we relied very heavily on the experience from other operational issues we had over years in the run up to COVID, and the learnings from those and how you respond. There's a specific operational playbook of like, okay, if I see this start to surge, then I take this action. It's indicative of this other failure mode. And so we were relying very heavily on that, and we were we were the ones kind of playing the video game, watching the charts every day. Like, okay, our chief operating officer's name is Jeff. Like, all right, Henderson is surging. Like, they're having a problem in this area. So the team was all hands on deck doing that. And then the other thing was we were doing all of the data analysis supporting the simplification of the orders. It's actually a very, very large deviation from normal third-party logistics practice to say, I'm going to send you a quantity of stuff different than what you ordered. If Amazon does that either up or down and then charges you for it, you're upset about it.
Livid.
Right. So then this became this all hands on deck series of interactions with customers to get their approval for this. It became this very complex. I mean, we were like scripting the modulo arithmetic for this, because the way you simplify orders is to have quantities that are exactly divisible by certain numbers, whether they're layers or full pallets. And so we're running these mod scripts that we wrote on like a Saturday against the orders that we're going to ship on Monday, saying, okay, if we do this, this is what's going to happen. If we do that, you find a kind of sweet spot. It's a negotiation.
So the truck rolls up to the grocery store and they just take what they get. It may not be what they ordered, but they take what they get. Right.
And then lastly, you have a whole bunch of work streams to try to keep people safe. Like Lineage is a very large organization. We've got about 15,000 employees in the US. And so you're now asking questions like, where is COVID versus where are our people? Even if we don't have direct indications yet of COVID infections at particular facilities, well, where should we be worried about in the context of who lives where? And then all of this while the supply chain is contemplating the kind of new normal. And the new normal for the supply chain is one that's less dependent on humans. So that's a robotics thesis. So we're designing the robots.
Is your team actually designing robots right now?
Oh yeah. The simulation I showed you was a production sim for
the computer vision, the autonomous forklift you showed us.
No, I'll show you. Well, I can't screen share again, but yeah. So we're the ones deciding. Okay, I want to build this robotic warehouse. What does it need to do? That's a statistical question. Then okay, I have this candidate layout. Is it capable of doing that? That's an exercise in scientific computing. What is the future supply chain going to look like? Because we get to build this building once, and modifying it is going to be prohibitively expensive. So now you're going into this kind of stochastic exercise of like, well, what will the future look like, and how future-proof am I? That involves like doing a whole bunch of Monte Carlos to try to break your stuff before you build it and figure out what it works against and what it doesn't.
I mean, this raises something that I've often wondered about in the context of COVID, which is, most machine learning models, rely heavily on training data. And yet, we're now in a scenario in which the future does not look like the past, or the present does not look like all our historical data. And so pretty quickly, like your training data, if you're trying to make predictions based on what happened in April of 2019, you're going to get it completely wrong for April of 2020. What do you do?
So Katie, let me share again. So first, to give you a short answer to your question, we don't know yet. We have not decided. Here is exactly what we can rely on, what we can't rely on. But to show you how the ML behaved during the COVID spike, we had a train. Then we kind of reached steady state. Is this stuff? The model doesn't really reach steady state until the physical warehouse reflects the new model, which means.
So this is showing errors over time. What does an error mean? An
error is so the prediction that we're making is pallet of chicken nuggets arrives at warehouse X. We're predicting how long it's going to stay to execute a thesis whereby we put the stuff that we need to access frequently at the front of the warehouse in a convenient location, and we put the stuff that's going to sit there for months or years in the back of the warehouse.
Perfect.
And so
you're
we're
sort of
predicting
steady
that,
state, 85% accurate.
right. So
under normal circumstances.
error here is the absolute value of the actual time spent in the warehouse minus the predicted time spent in the warehouse.
Perfect.
And so you can see here, we were just humming along. Then we decided to close and decontaminate the facility. So you had kind of a pause in everything. And then the supply chain actually doubled down. And this was partly us. We were sending predictable orders down the pipe in order to make sure and anticipate the needs of the retailers. And so the supply chain kind of doubles down. The error actually goes down for a little while. And then around mid-April, something weird starts to happen. And people are going to spend years analyzing all of this. And I don't think anyone has a totally obvious answer to this. But our hypothesis is that kind of you go through COVID for a few weeks, you're sheltered in place, you're ordering either your naive notion of what's going to be what you need to survive, like peanut butter and jelly and pasta, and you're just like going. And then you start to think, okay, this is going to last a while. And so now you start to see emergent cultural phenomena. Like, I want to bake bread at home. Well, that requires a certain bill of materials. That requires yeast. It requires eggs. All of that happened, and suddenly eggs are short, yeast is short, and that's throwing off our expectations.
That was a genuine change in demand. It wasn't just like a time shift, like shifting ahead my purchase of pasta. It was like, I genuinely didn't bake sourdough bread this time last year, but I am this year. And
exactly. And so that didn't happen until later. Like everything else was just what we call it the bullwhip. It's called in logistics the bullwhip effect, where you just kind of pull stuff and then it pulls back on you. But the new emergent phenomenon are actually like cultural in nature. And so take this. I saw this picture. I saw this in my local grocery store. I live in Oakland. I was at the Safeway in the North Shore of Alameda, and there's whole Thanksgiving turkeys sitting there in the meat section. This was during the time when people were when some of the meat processors were shutting down, and someone at either Safeway or Butterball turned around and said, "Hey, there's a quasi protein shortage, or there's a fear of a protein shortage, and everyone is stuck at home. Why the hell not?" Well, now you have Thanksgiving-like conditions where you need to feed a lot of people. You want protein. And I can tell you this inventory is in existence. The inventory build for turkeys for Thanksgiving 2020 started the day after Thanksgiving 2019.
You heard it here first, folks.
Right. So you're seeing retailers kind of push stuff forward and tell themselves stories and try it. It's not like there's a mechanism for a Safeway consumer to say, I want a turkey. And then it's not like Amazon where it's just like you have the direct connection between the supplier and the retailer. This is some logistics manager deciding, you know what, Thanksgiving turkeys might be something we should try. And then we check in our data, it turns out it's catching on. So,
yes, people bought turkeys. That's awesome.
Right. And so the upshot here, though, on the trading data is that this error, even at its worst at 20 days, is since settled down to about 15, which is not that far off from where it started. But it was actually better than the old human predictions we used to use. They used to be off by months. And so do you throw it out? Even if you assume the bias, even if you do nothing to counteract the bias, you're still largely doing better than you once were. And these cultural phenomenon are relatively recent and new. And so it's an interesting thing to explore. What I see us doing more is kind of selectively trying to curate this of like, okay,
testing,
throw out the shortages, like literally throw out the data when there were certain pork and beef shortages, because that's truly a unique
Not predictive. Yeah.
Right. But do people start cooking Thanksgiving turkeys in April? Well, depends on whether you're at home or not, which is in the current environment is a geographical question. What are the restrictions in each state?
Very cool. Switching gears a little bit, one thing you mentioned is that you worked with a startup to develop a vision system for forklifts. You're someone who does buy from early
Yes.
AI startups.
Right.
I know we have a bunch of entrepreneurs in the audience as well as investors. What's some advice you have that you would, if you could give a piece or two of advice to young AI startups trying to sell to logistics providers?
Yeah.
What advice would you give?
I think, especially in the product management realm, a ton of people use the word empathy. I don't know if I mean it exactly the same way, but a lot of startups who try to make sales pitches at us are not terribly empathetic when it comes to them, their startup is the center of the universe. And so they're interested in this one and only one particular application. And very often, and good for them, the startup's application is hyper focused. It could be computer vision for X. It could be this particular type of inventory management, or this freight execution platform, or whatever. But imagine, just in the context of what I've mentioned about COVID and our problem set in general, of we're fighting fires in all different directions. And so it's usually not that successful to come at us directly with here's my product, you need to buy it because I think it's important to your business. It's well, that may be true, but I've got problems with 6 zeros on them. I've got problems with 7 zeros on them. I've got problems with 8 zeros on them. And sometimes I got problems with 9 zeros on them. And so which one is it? What I think is the best way to go is that, if you are doing technology right in an industrial setting, talent acquisition has to be at the top of your priority list. And talent acquisition could come from direct employees. I mean, I said we have a 12-person team, love them to death. They're absolutely fantastic at what we do. But 12 people is not enough to manage all of the mathematical engineering underlying about half of the refrigerated food supply. So we have partners. Those partners could be startups. Those partners could be graduate students. Those partners could be other industrial companies. And the ones that have been most successful are the ones who tried to understand our business. And then we might have a year or two long sales cycle where they understand our business, I understand their capabilities, and then suddenly we got a 9-digit problem and let me make your day. But that discovery process is very much like recruiting, and it's very much like what I was describing in the very early stages of data science, learn the business.
Yeah, it's truly a partner relationship, not a vendor-customer relationship. Fantastic.
Absolutely.
Well, we've been joined by a couple of folks from the audience who have who submitted a couple questions for you, Elliott, and so we're gonna invite them up now. Let's start with Mike Cantrell. Mike is a co-founder at Parcel. And Mike, welcome to Zetta Bytes Live. Please share your question for Elliott.
Hey, yeah, thanks guys. Thanks for having me. So we work in supply chain with perishable goods, and then my question to you is what risks there are to perishable goods at Lineage, and how your team predicts and mitigates them.
Yeah, so there's broadly 3 ways that perishable goods can have a problem. The first is contamination, and that usually happens before the goods would get to us. So it would be romaine lettuce with E. coli that's packaged, and you can't unring that bell once it goes through the supply chain. The second is thermal control. And so when I showed one of the fluid dynamics simulations, that's probably the highest stakes thermal process that we undertake, where you deliver, or a food company will deliver hot product to us. It's ambient temperature, or it could be even at body temperature because it's recently slaughtered. That has to go from liquid to solid, at the risk of oversimplifying things, very, very quickly. And so we have spent absolutely enormous amounts of both brain damage and resources figuring out how to do that much more consistently. And then the third implicates the word perishability itself. Stuff takes just too long to get through the system. And the primary, you've got competing priorities when you're trying to move stuff. You want it landed as quickly as possible so that it has as much shelf life for the consumer remaining. You also want it landed as quickly as possible so that you can hold less inventory. The inventory turns are quite a big economic factor here. But on the flip side, there are other reasons to move it slowly through the supply chain. Like most of the product that we handle is either received on or sent via long haul semi trucks. And so 18-wheeler, 40,000 pounds net weight of product. And if you need to almost like have lumpy enough shipments and wait long enough in order to fill one of those things up, or else drive half empty, that doubles your energy per ton mile. And so we feel like we've solved blast freezing. I mean, there's been so much innovation around blast freezing, and it's been, how do you bring in innovations from data centers and aerospace and the car industry in order to get good airflow profiles? There's additional work to be done on packaging. Designing packaging is like designing an airplane in certain respects, but that speed it through the supply chain and have your cake and eat it too, get both the truck utilization and the decreased time on target, as we call it. Having those two things together, that is a really complex coordination problem of, okay, these two actors might not independently have enough volume to fill in a truck, but if I can recognize them, I can double them up and I can get them both. Neither one of them will have to wait because we can, but now you're taking all kinds of data, you're making all kinds of predictions about who's going to be sending what. You have carrier complexities that you need a whole bunch of software built and running around this in order to actually execute the orders. For freight, that coordination problem is where we think most of the action is. And this has huge implications for food waste, where generally speaking, the waste through the supply chain is actually quite minimal if you define it as, is this good when the consumer bought it? The waste that happens is, oh, the strawberries only had 4 days of shelf life in the consumer's refrigerator, and then the consumer didn't eat all the strawberries in 4 days, and so then they chucked them. Well, if you can get that through the supply chain a week faster, you go from 4 days to 11 days of shelf life once it's in the hands of consumers. And then, awesome.
That's fascinating, Elliott. I never thought about truck. I mean, I have thought about truck utilization as a logistics problem and an efficiency problem, but I have not thought of it as a perishability problem. That's really cool. Mike, thank you so much for joining us and asking that question. Now I'll invite Brennan Turner from FarmLead to share his question. Hi, Brennan, welcome. Brennan, you are on mute.
There we go. Thanks for having me, coming to you live from Ottawa, Canada this afternoon. My question is around food logistics. What do you think is the bigger issue or bigger challenge? Is it specifically related in the last mile delivery, or is it more in the long haul, figuring out where supply should meet demand, i.e. California avocados going to New York City or something like that?
Right. It all varies. We talked in Mike's question, talked about the different trade-off between perishability and truck utilization. If you're looking at the last mile delivery, the nature of the distribution centers at the local level, the facilities that might provide to an individual consumer, is they're so space constrained that there's no way they could make a play for good utilization. And they're also, the distances that they drive are so little that compared to driving across North America, that you're just admitting to yourself that you're gonna get really bad utilization. And you might actually get such bad utilization that it actually takes more gas to deliver it from the local DC to the consumer than it does to take it from Salinas, California to New York City. Because just if you just divide the fuel efficiencies of the different modes by the amount of stuff that you're storing, it's just immense. It's going to vary widely by channel. even though e-commerce is a huge growth area for the food system, you are still going to have Costco. You are still going to have a certain segment of the population going to the grocery store to buy things. In that particular case, it's really in the long haul, and it's really in the truck logistics. I think where this becomes interesting is, does e-commerce grow to such a level that you can actually get good utilization on the last mile? And the growth is there to ultimately achieve that within a few years, but what's becoming difficult is that a lot of the platforms are competing on the basis of things that make good outcomes difficult. So you can place an order and have it delivered within 2 hours. That's actually a really, really, really bad thing for transportation utilization. Because if I could say, well, hey, you tell me about your order a day ahead, and now we can go through and route optimize and send one picker to go pick 10 people's grocery store. The trip from the grocery store to the local neighborhood is now 10 times more efficient vis-a-vis the gasoline used. And so there's a lot of complexity. It depends on the channel, and I think we have to address both. Most of the Amazon trucks are empty, or not empty. They are only less than half utilized. If you imagine the efficiency of an Uber Eats driver, you might be moving 20 pounds of food in a single vehicle. Well, a long haul truck will shift 2,000 times that amount. But on the flip side, trucking utilization, at least in the refrigerated space, is only about 65%. And so you see all those trucks driving on the highway, and they're only about 65% utilized on average. And so both of them are rather fruitful areas for investigation.
Sounds like a massive opportunity on the table there, not just for sort of efficiency and cost savings, but also like thinking about all the fuel consumption, like a climate impact to be had there too. Wonderful. Well, Brendan, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it. I'm gonna monitor. Everybody in the audience has a Q&A panel at the bottom, and you are welcome to submit. I have more questions for Elliott, but you guys are welcome to submit questions too, and I'll try to weave them in. Elliott, I have a question that looks like it's from one of my coworkers. They want to know, are there hedge funds trying to buy your data?
There have been some discussions, but our data are, at this moment, our data are things that we use to improve outcomes for the supply chain, period.
Perfect. Good answer. I wanted to turn to a topic you touched on really lightly when we were talking about startups, which is that it's all about talent acquisition. And it's interesting because when I talk to enterprise data science leaders, so many of them feel like that is their fundamental problem. It's not a lack of problems. It's not a lack of ideas. It's not a lack of resources. It is, how do I actually manage to recruit data scientists against the FANGs? And you gave your own reason for doing that, but can you share any recruiting secrets with our audience?
I mean, I felt that the way that my current overlords came at me was frankly very effective. Like, if I put myself in the shoes of a technically interested person who's up for an adventure, the things that they did well in managing the process with me were namely agency and respect for the things that I knew that they didn't, but also my respect for the things that they knew that I didn't. And so I thought the recruitment process was an adventure whereby, hey, I get to see all this infrastructure. I've watched modern marvels on the History Channel my entire life. Now I go into these sites. And so we try to do the same thing when we recruit people. We generally recruit for differentiation as opposed to scaling. Like to hire a lot of people who can do stuff that we can't. And in that particular—
What's the background of people you end up hiring? Are these new college grads mostly? Are they?
The plurality of them are physicists. We've also got a marine biologist who helps us understand the fisheries dynamic. We have a few engineers. We have even an environmental fluid mechanics PhD out of Stanford. Historically, we have gone after people coming out of graduate school, and the maturity level is higher. But we now feel we have the infrastructure that we're going after younger and younger people. And so, but when we go after like take the hardest thing to recruit in the supply chain, which is like a kind of experience level data scientist, like that's
now we're talking about the talent supply chain, right?
Right. It's the talent supply chain, experienced data scientist. In that particular case, you respect the fact that you're hiring them precisely because they know more than you do. And so when we do that, we actually don't start with a job description. It's like we like to read them into our problems and then ask them what we're screwing up. And then through that process together, there's a self-discovery on both sides. And also, if it goes well, a kind of building of excitement for what the future holds. People, the primary things that we offer are, I mean, comp is comp, you have to be competitive, but agency and story are the things we try to give that Google just could not give anybody. Like the right to decide what you work on, relatively little supervision, the ability to take something totally from inception to production.
Yeah, those are some, I think, really great tips. I've got a couple more questions flowing in here on the chat. Yunfeng wants to know, what tech do you buy versus develop in-house?
I mean, so we have a whole bunch of tools that we'll lean on, and it strongly depends on what we're doing. For operational dashboards, we've used kind of outsourced software development shops who are really good at kind of front end and back end web development. They're building off of pretty standard tools, Angular, usually Postgres databases, kind of stuff that's available. For kind of emergency production stuff, like some of the stuff that went down under COVID, we were relying pretty heavily on Periscope, which is Sisense. A lot of the stuff that we do is actually not manifested in a web product. And so it's manifested in the physical building design. We use data science to figure out what the rack opening sizes should be for a warehouse pallet rack. That's not something that needs to be debugged and beta tested. It's just like, no, here, Mr. Contractor, here's your design, like, go do it. And that's something that we do once and hope to never touch again. And so in that case, it's much more like a graduate school experience where you're writing an academic paper where the actual product is the visualization or whatever else. And so for that we're using a stack that would look very similar to any technical graduate student in the United States. R, MATLAB, Python, Pandas. We use a lot of discrete event simulation. I try to stay as open source as possible. And that's both philosophical. But it's also just absolutely amazing what's available in terms of Python libraries, in terms of R packages.
Completely. We've got another question here from Chris. How robust is the required sensor data in the cold chain? Are there Achilles heels in monitoring and data collection? And how often do you need extra hardware?
So there are federally mandated minimums when it comes to monitoring. I assume when you talk about monitoring, you're talking about temperature monitoring.
I would imagine that too, although in trucks, maybe also shocks.
Yeah, there's also vibration monitoring needed for certain sensitive commodities.
Eggs.
The feds, like, vibration as a failure mode will not make someone sick. Temperature as a failure mode will make someone sick. And for things that will make someone sick, the FDA has a set of rules that you just have to follow. You need a certain number of sensors. There's pretty common practices in trucks where you put in something called a temp tail, which is a sensor about the size of a deck of cards, and it changes color if ever the temperature exceeded a certain set threshold. And so that's broadly sufficient to make sure that someone doesn't die. Like, if you hear of food safety issues, they're almost always due to contamination at the source. So it'd be like E. coli outbreak or listeria or something that had to be in there that doesn't just, and even if most of our inventory that we're moving is freezer, even if you thaw it, that's still not a particularly good environment for bacteria to grow. It's just you went from ice cube to chilled stuff. Consumers can imagine that. Now, that has not been enough for us for a lot of our applications. So one of our primary applications is actually load balancing the power grid, whereby we have tremendous thermal mass inside of these facilities. So we will actually schedule their power consumption to avoid peak energy rates. And the effect of this is sometimes they're consuming more than they otherwise would, other times they're consuming less. And so that's like you put a behind the meter battery system on your cold storage warehouse. Now, if you're going to do something like that, you're actually intentionally thermally cycling the food supply. We added 2 zeros on the sensor count so that we knew exactly what was going on in that area. And not because we were concerned about losing control in a particular area, not that we were concerned about thawing something accidentally, but because if you're going to do that, you need to have a very precise thermal understanding of what's going on in your warehouse. And the way to judge whether what you think is going to happen is actually going to happen is how close are your models to your sensor data. And so suddenly we start deploying lots and lots and lots and lots of sensors so that you can make 3D temperature maps of this warehouse.
So cool. I think we have time for one last question. I'm going to pressure you to answer it quickly, but I think you may have a terse answer. Monica asks, how do you prioritize projects when you're not dealing with a pandemic? Do you always have clarity on the dollars available and coming up with a solution, or is it more of like matching what people are capable of? So
this is how we prioritize is mostly a function of the fact that we're private equity backed, and also I had experience before I went to grad school working in private equity. We view it like investments. So the job of Lineage Logistics, which is privately held, is to deploy capital to turn it into more capital, like not unlike a venture fund or any other private equity fund. And so take warehouse rack design. We throw $250,000 at rejiggering the rack heights. It makes us $10 million worth of warehouse. So on a valuation basis, we've turned $250,000 into $10 million, which is a trade that anyone at any fund would make all day long.
All day.
And so that's how we view it, is in terms of that arbitrage.
Elliott, you've mentioned something called the money equation to me before. You want to just quickly share that?
Yeah, so the economics of warehousing are really not that hard to figure out. You've got your revenue, which is a function of how much you can store, the quantity, times the price, which is usually a function of how commoditized your business offerings are. And then you've got two big expenses, power and labor. And so all of the data science applications implicate one or more of those terms in the money equation, with the sole exception, and I do mean sole exception, of safety, whether it's safety of our workers or safety of the food consuming public. And so each will think through our projects in terms of the money equation and in terms of their costs, and then we'll say, okay, the most bang for the investment dollar is doing this or doing that. And is in the 7-year history of Lineage Data Science, we've basically hit every single term of the money equation. Some of the projects hit more than one, but that's how we think through it, as if we were private equity investors.
That's outstanding. Elliott, thank you so much. This has been fascinating. I've learned a ton today. I think our audience asked great questions. Thank all of you for joining us.
No, thank you for all your support. You've been such a wonderful partner over so many years at this point.
Oh, thank you, Elliott. And a special thanks also to Brennan and Mike, who joined us live. And if you enjoyed this, I hope you'll all mark your calendars for September 16th. Our next Zetta Bytes Live will be with Anthony Goldblum, the CEO of Kaggle. And if you want to stay abreast of future events hosted by Zetta, then please subscribe to our newsletter. You can find it at zettavp.com. Elliott, thank you so much once again.
No, thank you.
And everybody, happy Wednesday.
Cheers.